Welcome to Paratruth.
How's it going, Paratruthers? Welcome to Paratruth Reborn. This is a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. My name is Justin, and we are without Erik today, so I am going to be doing this interview solo. Today, we're going to be having on Tim Rayborn. Tim is an acclaimed and prolific writer of books on many different topics. Reason we have him on is because of the books of The Strange and Weird, and we had him on last month, 2 months ago, when this episode comes out, to talk about scary Christmas lore, and today we're going to be having him on to talk about the scary book of Valentine's Day lore. Tim, welcome back to Paratruth Reborn.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back. It was great fun last time, so I'm happy to be back.
Awesome. So you have done two different books on scary lore for two different holidays.
Yes.
For the Valentine's Day lore, how much research went into this? And was it, I know we're in the age of digital information, but did you have to do like deep dives on a lot of this stuff?
Some of them, yeah. The book is a little different. So the Scary Book of Christmas lore was all about monsters. A lot of it is about, as you remember, it's about Krampus, it's about Frau Perchta, it's about all these, the Yule Cat. And there's no end of strange and crazy winter monsters and crazy things in Europe and beyond. The Valentine's Day book was a little different. They asked me to do a sequel. It's the same publisher, and I definitely wanted to do it. It's going to be an ongoing series, actually, and I've just finished the third book, and I'll talk about that toward the end of because that'll be out toward the end of this year. Okay. But the Valentine's things were interesting because there are no, as far as I can tell, there aren't any Valentine's Day monsters.
Right.
There's no. I was hoping there would be. I was hoping there'd be a Valentine's Day wolf or something, or a Bigfoot that appears every February 14th in the wilds of British Columbia or something like that. And people leave out roses for it or something and whatever, but sadly there were no monsters, so I had to look for other kinds of stories that keep in the and one of the first things, of course, is ghost stories. There's plenty of ghost stories about doomed love and forbidden love and all of that, so ghosts are a big deal in there. There's a lot of great urban legends. There are some really fantastic myths, particularly Greek myths and some of the other old stories, and also some really interesting real life sort of tragedies that I wanted to delve into as well. So yeah, I had to search around to different kinds of sources this time to find these stories. There's real life murder mysteries and Greek myths, and lots of tragedy in this one. This is more about like betrayal and death and murder and such this time rather than. But there are some great ghost stories as well and urban legends, which I've managed to put in. So yeah, the focus is a little different, but hopefully the stories will be just as unsettling.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, reading through some of them, it was rather interesting to say the least. Something that I have found fascinating about both Saint Valentine and Saint Nicholas both had two separate people in Valentine's case, 2 to 3 separate people who had the same or similar name. So in your opinion, which is responsible for the holiday and why?
That's an interesting question. I don't even think the Catholic Church knows. I think there was a tradition of multiple Valentines, and they basically canonized all of them and celebrated them on the same day, I think, just to cover all their bases. But the original story had to do with it was a classic sort of martyr story, and it had to do with Valentine, the original Valentine, being an official, or perhaps like a Roman. He was a Roman of some kind who probably secretly became a Christian priest in I think it was the 3rd century. Around the same time that St. Nicholas lived, actually, and he started holding services and such. And at one point, there was a Roman official or military officer came to him, and his daughter was very ill, and Valentine went to him and healed him. And the official was so impressed that he decided to convert to Christianity. And then when the emperor heard about this, he was furious and he ordered Valentine to be beheaded. So most of the stories are kind of variations on that. And he always ends up with his head on a chopping block, basically. So it might be that there was only one person whose story got filtered out into multiple different variations, because that happens quite a lot. It might have been that there was more than one, but both of them ended up getting the same fate. Maybe one of them died and the other didn't. Or maybe the whole thing is just entirely a folkloric tradition that someone made up. We're not absolutely certain. I think most historians accept that there probably was a Valentine, a Valentinus, pretty common name actually in the Roman. It would be like, you know, a common enough sort of name that it wouldn't be unusual for somebody to have done this and maybe to have met a sharp end on the business end of an axe. So it's possible that it's an amalgamation of multiple different legends and myths, and sometimes they split off into different versions. What you will see with stories like this is that different regions will have different variations, and that's actually what we see here. There's the different versions of Valentine, Valentinus, that we see come from different parts of Italy, so it's entirely possible that they are folkloric, and that the original was something a little bit different, or a smush of all of these, or it branched off into something, or it was a folk tale that found its way into different parts of Italy, central and southern Italy, and became popular, and the local people embellished it in their own way with their own, you know, whatever story was relevant to them. At this point, we're, you know, 17 centuries on, it's pretty much impossible to tell. But we do know that the original Saint Valentine, or the Valentine, whichever one it was canonized by the church into proper sainthood, and it was celebrated on February 14th throughout the Middle Ages. Now, how like this martyr who got his head cut off relates to a day for romantic love is a different story. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, from what I remember from the book, and even going back into my own research, like the reason we have Valentine's Day cards is the research I had originally done was somebody had sent him a letter while he was in prison, and it was labeled "To My Valentine."
Yeah, there's a again, it's an ancient urban legend that while he was awaiting execution, someone who loved him, maybe even was in love with him, smuggled a letter into him. Yeah, or another version says that he sent a letter to someone outside from your Valentine. So it could have been either. We don't know about that. That's a tradition that may have grown up in the Middle Ages several hundred years later. A lot of these types of stories, they existed, and then whoever was writing them or rewriting them, they weren't concerned with historical accuracy. They were just simply trying to tell a good story and make a point. And so it's entirely possible that never happened. But that's very possibly where it came from. And it seems like from where we get it associated with romantic love comes from Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales, who wrote quite a few other things as well. And I believe, actually, let me check the book here. I can actually find it and see what it says here. It was in his The Parliament of Fowls, which means the Parliament of Birds. It was an allegory about English politics, but from a bird's perspective. And this was written in 1375, and he wrote about the gathering, for this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every fowl cometh to choose his mate. So this seems to be the first idea. There was a tradition. It's entirely possible that birds began to start singing again on February 14th in the middle of what was still winter in Northern Europe. But then you would hear the birds singing and you knew that spring was on the way. It was a kind of Groundhog Day thing, almost like if you heard the birds singing on February 14th, you knew that spring, that winter would eventually start melting off, the snows would melt. So Chaucer seems to have taken that and put it into a poem, into his poem, his very famous poem, and said that this was the day that birds not only started chirping again and calling and singing, but that was the day that they also basically got together and hooked up. so that became kind of a thing that later writers also took on. And there's some evidence that I think it was King Henry, I want to say Henry IV, maybe, but I might be wrong. It was in the early 15th century in England that there was a duke, or perhaps a famous earl, who actually did send. It wasn't a king. It was a nobleman who sent his wife some sort of elaborate, illuminated message on Valentine's Day, and that was, some people consider that to be the first Valentine's Day card, really, for real. Although that might be an urban legend. We're not sure, but from there, it seems like it actually really, it started, kind of what's the word? Like the avalanche, the picking up speed. And by the 16th century, King Henry VIII actually declared it an unofficial holiday in England, honoring St. Valentine, but people also started turning it into a day for romantic love as well.
Well, I've never understood the Groundhog's Day tradition, so hearing that Valentine's is kind of the similar thing is kind of interesting. Something that I had never heard of when it came to Valentine's Day is the vinegar Valentines.
I love those.
Go ahead.
It's a tradition we need to revive, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I feel the same way about ghost stories during Christmas, so I completely get that too.
Christmas monsters and horrible Valentine cards, absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about this tradition. Like, what was involved in sending these nasty cards or letters?
It seems to have developed in the sorry, I'm just fixing something. My screen's being funny. It developed in the Victorian age in England, sometime in the mid-19th century. This idea came about where people would send not just Valentine's Day cards to people that they loved, but also fairly nasty cards to people that they didn't like. And I love that. It's I'll pull open the page here. I marked it off since you had mentioned it, and where is it? There we are. Yeah, I'll read a little bit from it because it really highly amuses me. It's a wonderful tradition that needs to make a comeback, I think. So let's see, vinegar Valentines. Yes, these delightfully subversive and sometimes awful creations were basically anti-Valentine's Day cards. You didn't send one of those to someone you loved, but to someone you disliked. Beginning in England in the 1830s or 1840s, it was actually quite early then, forgotten, and continuing for the next several decades, it's thought that their most popular vinegar Valentines made up almost one half of all Valentine's Day cards sent. I love that. The cards could have messages that mildly poked fun at the recipient, or they could be vicious, depending on the feelings of the person sending the card. Illustrated with often grotesque drawings, they might mock a particular person or even their whole profession. You could send such a card to anyone you disliked and have it tailored to them. It could be a horrible boss, a greedy landlord, a corrupt politician, an ex, or a terrible family member. Even worse, these cards were often sent COD, meaning the recipient had to pay the postage due on them. It's like, since many of them are destroyed, we only have a few surviving cards, but some of the messages were fantastic. Like, because I love another, there's no chance for you.
Oh, jeez.
Do you ever mend your clothes or comb your hair? Well, I suppose you've got no time, for you're doing nothing but reading novels all day. Don't imagine anyone will ever take you for a gentleman. As you can imagine, these cards didn't go over well, and even if we see them as funny now, there are reports of fights, lawsuits, and suicides coming about because of these biting communications. There's even one case of an angry husband who shot his estranged wife after receiving one from her. But often such cards were sent anonymously to protect the senders from such a retaliation. As the trend went on, more and more people began to push back against it in letters to newspapers, calling them vulgar and cruel, which they certainly could be. Eventually, their popularity died down, but for several decades in the 1800s, vinegar Valentines ruled the day, and the sensitive souls out there might have needed to approach February 14th with a little bit more apprehension. So, crazy things. I love them.
Well, and if you really think about it, 1800s, although it is a long time, it's not that far away from compared to ancient times.
Yeah, absolutely. So. It's, we have grandparents and great grandparents that knew people that lived in those times. So it's still within not living memory, but a generation or two away. So it's a sign of the times. And Victorian England was undergoing such drastic, massive change with the Industrial Revolution, and literally the entire country transformed in the space of 40 or 50 years. So there's probably a need to just let off some steam, in some cases, really. So, yeah. But I think they were eventually considered to be too cruel. And I think it wasn't so much that they were banned, but they were just they fell out of fashion eventually. I think they weren't popular anymore, and it came to be seen as something not so much funny, but kind of vulgar and crude after a while. So, yeah.
Now, something that is odd to me, but it does make a little bit of sense too, is a lot of the bloodshed that happens around the time of Valentine's Day. But one of the things that I found fascinating, because I do kind of remember reading about it at an earlier age, was the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that and what that brought that about.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with love specifically, but the fact that it happened on Valentine's Day meant that I had to include it in the book.
Right.
It was one of the most notorious gangland murders, almost certainly ordered by Al Capone in Chicago, in the back in the day, and it still technically remains unsolved. Capone was sneaky. He was, as you may know, he was finally got on tax evasion. They never actually got him on any of the hits that he put out,
Right.
or murders
Yep.
or anything else. So they went after his taxes, and that was the only thing that they ever got him on. So it remains one of the most notorious, technically unsolved crimes in American history. So again, I can read a little about it from the book, because it's better to me to do that than just waffle on about it and pretend I know what I'm talking about. Yes, the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre had absolutely nothing to do with love or celebrating the holiday. Quite the opposite. In fact, it was an act of brutality showing the high levels of mob activity in Chicago during the 1920s. Crimes that the city government and police couldn't or wouldn't stop. Various gangs slugged it out on Chicago's streets, each trying to gain the upper hand and establish their empires, but no one was more ruthless than Al Capone, who wanted to be top dog for every illegal enterprise from bootlegging to gambling, and he had no problem taking out rivals. When Prohibition became American law in 1920, those involved in the organized crime world saw a perfect chance to make huge amounts of money by producing and selling alcohol illegally, and make huge amounts of money they did. Gambling and prostitution dens also brought in a hefty amount of cash. Capone was probably worth $100 million by the end of the 1920s, an absolutely stunning sum for the time. $100 million in 1925 would be worth more than $1.8 billion today. And he lavished some of that wealth on charities like soup kitchens and other community institutions, which made him very popular with the locals. In his quest to become rich and powerful, Capone ordered hundreds of hits and murders during his reign over the underworld, but he was always very careful not to be directly linked to them, which is why the police and even the early FBI had such trouble catching him. As you might know, he was eventually arrested for tax evasion. In any case, one especially brutal slaying took place on February 14th, 1929. At the time, Capone's main rival was an Irish gangster named George Bugs Moran. Capone was determined to strike hard at his enemy and sent some of his own goons, dressed as policemen, to a garage on the north side of the city. There they found 7 of Moran's men working on a bootlegging operation. The fake police officers gunned them down, firing off approximately 70 rounds of ammunition. When the real police arrived, they found just one man, Frank Gusenberg, still alive, but he refused to talk and died shortly afterwards. Bugs was actually on his way to the garage, but arrived after the shooting and was thus unharmed. The murder soon branded the St. Valentine's Day massacre, shocked even those used to the city's gang violence. Capone, who was at his home in Florida, denied having anything to do with it, though most investigators believed him to be responsible. Bugs blamed Capone, while Capone said that Bugs had done it, presumably to frame Capone. Once again, he escaped justice, and since no one was ever charged with the murders, it's still one of the more shocking unsolved crimes in American history. So yeah, he took out a whole series of rivals brutally to send a message without ever having his name even attached to it. It happened. I don't think it was deliberately done on Valentine's Day. I think that was incidental, but it's one of the darker things that Valentine's Day is now remembered for is that.
Right. Well, one of the main reasons I wanted to include that in this is because Al Capone does have kind of a link to here in Bismarck, North Dakota, because his gang had supposedly during Prohibition was the reason alcohol was being brought into Bismarck specifically.
Right.
And you know, as much as good as the mob has done with charities and giving back to the poor and stuff like that, we chastise them because of the brutality of it all, which, I mean, yeah, they're breaking the law, but it's kind of a Robin Hood type thing.
It is. Yeah, a lot of people. He was responsible. Capone's charities fed, it was an insane amount. It was like, I think at the height of it, sometime in the late 20s in Chicago, or maybe it was even during the Depression, actually, he was handing out something like 10,000 meals 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, absolutely free to anybody that wanted them, regardless. You just come in and get your morning coffee, or you come and get sandwiches at lunch or whatever. Yeah, absolutely free, no strings attached, open to absolutely anyone that wanted it. So he made sure that his name was attached to all of those things. He managed to distance himself from the killings, but he made sure that his name was all over those things. So
right,
only enhanced his image in the hands of, the working class and poor people that might have been laid off, or, whatever. If they were in the middle of the depression and making no money, at least they wouldn't starve to death. So he was very generous with financing that. And yeah, it fed 30,000 meals a day at one point. It was astonishing, the level of charity that was actually being undertaken there. Saved a lot of people's lives, undoubtedly.
So I'm big into Greek mythology and in turn Roman mythology. So reading the mythology about Eros, who eventually became Cupid, was kind of interesting because, growing up, you don't learn that part of the lore, the bloody part of the lore. You mentioned the Disney version of Cupid in the book. So what are your thoughts on, is that the reason why we see so much kind of bloodshed during Valentine's Day or in love in general?
It's interesting. That's actually a really good question. Yeah, we're used to seeing Cupid as being this sort of fat little baby boy with his tiny little bow and arrow, and
right.
That actually was a very popular image in Renaissance and later paintings as well. You'd have all of these paintings
the
of
cherubs,
Venus or Adonis and Venus. You'd have little cherubs all around, and they have little wings, and they're just like, oh, shoot the little things here. But yeah, the originals were considerably darker and more wild than that. As I said in the book, there's the figure of what they in the Middle Ages called the god of love was actually a full-grown man. And in that one particular long poem, The Romance of the Rose from 13th century France, he actually shoots the main character with an arrow that causes him to fall in love, and the hero basically starts a war over it. It's pretty intense. But I think going back to the originals, looking back at Eros, from where we get our word erotic, and in those any things that derive from that, Eros was the son of Aphrodite and Mars, which is your classic love and war. So there was something dangerous about him. He had Aphrodite's propensity for love, but he also had Mars's propensity for violence and war. So the two were seen as married to one another right in that early time, whether 5th, 6th century Greece or even earlier, BC Greece. That was that. So Eros, right from the top, is kind of a dark character. There's a little bit more of a sense of wildness about him. He's a little bit more like Dionysus, the god of wine. There's a sense of danger about being around him. If you're shot by an arrow from Eros, that's not a good thing. It's actually because love in its own ways can make people abandon all reason. They can act like animals. They can murder. And I think the Greeks saw that in this. And so they saw, some of them saw love in that sense, romantic love, is almost like an affliction of the mind, a disease of the mind, a mental affliction, a mental illness, if you will. And Eros sort of embodied that. If you were struck by one of his arrows, it meant that you were afflicted with a madness that could potentially be quite dangerous. So he was to be approached with caution. He wasn't a god that we can tell that was widely worshipped, and it's possibly because of that. There were some temples or some things dedicated to Eros, but he was not nearly as widely revered as Aphrodite, as the goddess of love, or Mars was revered as Ares, I should say, was revered as a god that armies would make offerings to before going to war, for instance.
Right.
So I'll read a little bit here. We find some stories about him Eros, and it's interesting though because Eros might have, by maybe the 5th century BCE. Eros was probably downgraded to a bit of a minor god, but it seems that in earlier times, he might have actually been seen as a very important, almost a figure with sort of creator god or Titan-like features. And that would make sense because the Titans themselves were the older race, and they were wildly unpredictable, just like love can be. So in the 5th century, the playwright Aristophanes wrote his comedy called The Birds, which, as I said, has nothing to do with Alfred Hitchcock. But he wrote that Eros sprang forth from a primordial egg and then mated with chaos itself to produce the human race. Yeah, it's not what we would consider a romantic origin story. So here's this young god fathering the human race out of chaos. And that's an interesting statement about what we as human beings might be. And it speaks to like the idea of the savage versus the civilized and such. So we were born of chaos, but had to be civilized later. But Eros still represents that dangerous, chaotic side. So there he's not actually the son of Aphrodite and Ares. He's the son of a primordial creation, something much, much older that is not even within the realm of the Greek gods. He sort of supersedes them in a sense, and he's more like a Titan in that case. But if he's the actual creator of the human race, that puts him above even Zeus. and the other Greek pantheons. So it's really interesting. I find that fascinating. He was said to be quite beautiful, and his power was considerable. He could make anyone, god or mortal, bow to obsessive love and lust, and that made him a force to be reckoned with. His arrows could be fired at a god, and they could make the god go crazy, mad with love as well. Through his works, arrows could control minds and wills, and madness, violence, and war resulted from those put in the throes of obsession. Eros' reputation was well established in ancient Greece when he was said to have caused some gods to burn with love and desire, and eventually to lose their minds. Later on, early Christians took Eros to be a real threat, with such writers as Isidore of Seville, he was a bishop in the early church, believing that Eros was a demon sent to tempt the minds into lust and bring ruin. Whether as a primordial god or the son of Aphrodite, his behaviors were pretty much the same, and his mother did nothing but encourage him. While she was definitely worshipped by far more people over time, Eros had his own followers, possibly those who hoped that they could appease him and somehow master their own hearts, misled by wishful thinking. So Eros, to me, almost takes this kind of if he's a primordial force, then that makes him immensely powerful, and that means that we as his creations can never control those urges and those things. And that could have been the warning. The warning of Eros is that he if we give into that too much, we give into chaos. If we are half chaos and half primordial being, then what does that make us? It means that we are subjected to that chaos. So the idea of the later telling of Aphrodite and Ares may be a reflection of that, where Aphrodite represents the love and the passion and such, whereas Ares represents destruction. So it could be the same thing here. We're seeing an earlier version of that, but in both cases, it means that humanity's kind of screwed. So
right,
it's a bit of a problem with that. Yeah, but I find that really fascinating. He reminds me a bit in that sense of the other god, Dionysus, who was actually a minor god, but who could inspire people to acts of madness and revelry and drunkenness and such. So there's an element of chaos about Eros that is way more frightening and dangerous than the chubby little Cupid, flying around the edges of Renaissance painting. There's something really dangerous about him, and you don't want that in your life overly much, or your life will tip into chaos. And I think that was the warning for a lot of the myths about him, is that if you give in to these urges and desires too much, they will ruin your life and bring you to ruin, basically bring nothing but sorrow and destruction and chaos, just the same as a war god would bring, but for completely different reasons, because Eros had power over gods as well as humanity. So it made him very dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting, that the beginning story of humanity, because we hear about Christianity's beginning of humanity all the time, but a lot of other religions and mythology, it kind of relates more to those religions as to what humanity is now compared to Christianity. There's a lot of Middle Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean creation stories in general are a lot more about bringing order out of chaos. At the beginning, there's all primal chaos. It's weirdly similar in some ways to the notion of the Big Bang and like the fiery energies being released. And at the beginning, there's nothing but energy and potentiality. And then the gods bring order out of that. You find that in Egypt. You find that in Mesopotamia. You find versions of that even in the Norse mythology as well. That there's these things there's a chaos out of which later generations of gods fashion order and such, and that was very true for those. So there's an interesting idea that at one point everything was wild, fiery, watery chaos with no order at all, but somewhere along the line certain beings decided to bring order to that rather than having control over it. Those things pre-existed, so there was a pre-existing chaotic universe out of which these beings arose and decided to make it into something more orderly, and that's where Eros fits as well. Now, there's so many more tales in mythology, with the old gods about love and Valentine's Day type stuff. Did you have any favorite stories that you came across?
I really like that one. I thought that was great. Let me have a quick look. There's a whole bunch. I have a whole bunch in here. The story of Isis and Osiris, speaking of creator gods, is another one that I love. The ancient Egyptian. It's fabulous. It's amazing, and it's a story about a god who dies and is reborn into something new. And it's really fascinating how that works, because it's very violent and very brutal.
Oh, yeah.
I'll do a quick read from it. It's a wonderful story. absolutely wonderful. Some wonderful art in this. It's the same artist that did the artwork for the Christmas book as well. I'm very, very pleased with it.
Okay.
Yeah, the classic myth of Isis and Osiris has several versions. As you might expect from such an extremely old tale, there's evidence of the Egyptians worshipping Osiris from as far back as 4,500 years ago. He was an early form of the god that dies and is resurrected, and he was crucially important for Egyptian culture. According to the myths, Osiris, along with his queen Isis and his brother Set, were the offspring of the sky goddess Nut and the earth god Geb, and he ruled Egypt fairly and with justice. There's less written about his reign, though, than his grisly end in return. Set was jealous of his brother and felt that he should be the one to rule. Why did he hate Osiris? There are different versions of where the grudge came from, with some stories claiming it was because Osiris was carrying on with Set's consort, Nephthys. Another version saying that Osiris kicked Set at some point, but he never got over it. In any case, Set began to plot his brother's downfall and came up with a creative way to do it. He threw a lavish party and invited Osiris to attend. There he presented a wooden box to all of the guests, which he had instructed to be made fit to fit Osiris perfectly. The Set then proclaimed that whoever could fit perfectly in the box would win the box itself. Various guests tried, but none could do it. Then Osiris gave it a go and settled inside with ease. Set, along with his accomplices, slammed the lid on the box shut, trapping Osiris. They took the chest to the Nile River and threw it in, believing themselves to be done with him. Upon hearing the news, Isis, consumed by rage and grief, went in search of Osiris's body and found it in the river. She wanted to make sure that he received proper funeral rites. Funerals were a big deal, obviously, for the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. But hearing of her efforts, Set managed to get the body and cut it into 14 pieces. Some versions say 42, which he then scattered across Egypt. Set then took the throne of Egypt for himself, as he'd always wanted. Not to be denied, Isis went in search of her husband's body and was able to reassemble Osiris's corpse with the help of the gods of the dead, Anubis and Thoth. She found all of the parts except for his male member, so a new one had to be made. Anyway, they put him back together and mummified him, and with the artificial member, she was able to conceive a son with his restored body, whom she hid then from Set. That son, the hawk-headed god Horus, grew up to avenge his father's murder. He defeated Set in combat, banished his uncle, and ruled in place of Osiris, who had now become lord of the underworld. Isis's love for Osiris saved Egypt, and for this she was worshipped for centuries, an esteem that sustained itself all the way through the 14th century, when it's claimed that some Egyptian women still went to Isis statues for healing and help with their pregnancies. So it's a really fascinating example. It's a myth that in one way endured for over 5,000 years, which is absolutely incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for a wife to do that for her husband after being murdered so gruesomely, yes. I mean, that story in and of itself from Egyptian mythology has always stuck with me, just because you do see Osiris rise from the dead, so to speak, but becomes lord of the underworld.
Yeah. And his green face is significant as well, because it ties in with the vegetation and the greenery, the fertility along the Nile. So each year when the Nile returned and the land was made green again, it represented that rebirth every year as well. So that's why he's always depicted with a green face. He's kind of the underworld god, but also the god of vegetation and of rebirth. So it's very important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we all know that chocolate is linked to Valentine's Day, so it was very fascinating to me to find a murderess who had dealt with chocolate. So I wanted you to share this story with our listeners about Christiana Edmonds.
Christiana Edmonds, the infamous chocolate cream killer. That's a fabulous one. This is like something out of one of those police procedurals, that you'd see. This would make a really great historical movie, actually. I'm surprised somebody hasn't done a movie or a miniseries set in Victorian England with this. But yeah, she was quite a piece of work. So everybody, of course, loves chocolate. For the poor victims living in Brighton, England, on the south coast of England, in 1870s, chocolate actually became deadly. The subject of this tale, Christiana Edmonds, was born in Kent, south of London, in 1828, and grew up in a wealthy family who saw to it that she received a good education. Still, there was always seemed to be something a bit off about her, and a doctor diagnosed her with hysteria in the late 1850s. Now, bear in mind that this was, often a sexist catch-all diagnosis that male doctors would just give. Oh, she's acting up. She has hysteria. However, it seems that Christiana was definitely troubled, suffered mental health issues, and while living with her mother in the late 1860s, she began an affair with a married man, a doctor named Charles Beard. Christiana seems to have wanted the wife out of the way, so she offered Mrs. Beard a chocolate cream that she'd poisoned. The wife became very sick, but she didn't die. Beard would later say that he suspected Christiana was the culprit, but he didn't have proof, and plus, being a typical Victorian, he didn't want his dirty little secret to be made public. In any case, the incident seemed to help Christiana develop a taste for poisoning. By 1871, she started acquiring chocolate creams and poisoning them with strychnine, and then having a local vendor, John Maynard, sell them. She obtained the poison from a local chemist, saying that she needed it to kill stray cats, but it wasn't cats on her mind, it was people. She even tried to hide her activities by sending a couple of boys to buy the poison for her. As a result of her awful activity, several people became ill from eating the chocolates, but at first no one died, and no one linked the chocolates to these incidents. In June of 1871, a young boy, Sidney Barker, ate one of the chocolates and died. The coroner was able to link his death to the chocolate from the shop, but thought the poisoning was accidental. Christiana then started sending her poisoned chocolates to unsuspecting recipients, including Mrs. Beard, who again became very sick. It was now clear that someone was poisoning people with chocolate, but Christiana tried to deflect suspicion by mailing some of them to herself, claiming that she had been targeted, presumably by Maynard. Finally, Dr. Beard did the right thing and told the police about his suspicions, but denied that anything had ever happened between him and Christiana. Her evil plan fell apart quickly, and she was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death, although her sentence was eventually reduced to life in prison. She lived out the rest of her days at an insane asylum, dying in 1907. We'll never know what drove her to use the world's tastiest treat to try to kill random people, but it probably put the people of Brighton off of Valentine's Day chocolate for a long time.
Well, and I mean, we all know the story of Sweeney Todd, and
Absolutely.
using meat pies to kill people and feed them to other people.
Yes.
So, unfortunately, it's one of those things that, especially in England specifically, some of the most horrific things were done with food.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are whole traditions of these. There's whole books about these kinds of things. These crazy. We tend to think of the Victorians as being so prim and proper and innocent and whatever, but there was actually a really dark undercurrent to the entire society. Vinegar Valentines being an example. There's all sorts of really crazy things like this. Some of the most atrocious murders and serial killers you can imagine. Everybody thinks of Jack the Ripper, but there were a lot of other things that went on in those times as well, when you have a society facing rapid change as they did, and also dramatic inequality, hundreds of thousands of people moving to cities and being displaced and living in slums and terrible working conditions and such. And it strains the I don't know the word, the tape holding society together, and things start to crack and they start to fall apart. And so it's only natural that you'll start seeing these sorts of things be brought to light. And there are whole books on Victorian murders and crimes that make for really fascinating, really fascinating reading. The stories of things like Sherlock Holmes come out of a very real world where these kinds of things, you had like these crazy crimes to an extent that you'd never seen before in the history of the nation, because so many people were clustered together in these enormous cities like London and Birmingham and Manchester and such. So it was only a matter of time before things like this started happening, as people got on top of each other. They were sick, they were dying, they were getting on each other's nerves. There's just like a whole series of social problems. These things are almost like you're opening a little black curtain and peering behind it to see the underneath the facade that everybody liked to present. So
for real, yeah.
So this is a very good example of it. This is not something from a poor working family. This is a very decent, well-to-do middle-class person that just snapped and decided she wanted to start murdering people with chocolate.
That baffles the mind for sure. But
you really have to wonder. Yeah,
it's one of those things that.
Why does any serial killer do what they want to do? What they do?
Right. For real.
Yeah.
Something that any holiday has is very interesting traditions. The one that grabbed my attention from this book was the old Scottish tradition of throwing garbage on one or both of the betrothed. So can you tell us a little bit about that tradition? Because it has to do with molasses and garbage and fish guts and all that.
Guts, yeah. I am Scottish, so I can laugh at this and make fun of it. So that's my excuse. So yeah, they did this because Scotland. That's fine. So. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. It's an old Scottish wedding. Well, we think it's old. We don't know how old. It might have been
Right.
1965, but people traditionally throw things at weddings: rice to the bride and groom as they're leaving, or the bridal bouquet to a group of young, hopeful women. In Northeast Scotland, however, the act of throwing things occasionally gets a whole lot messier for spouses to be, as an old folk custom known as the blackening still sometimes takes place. At some point before the wedding, one or both of the couple will be abducted, quote unquote, by their friends and subjected to what can only be described as torture. They'll be taken somewhere and then doused with all sorts of garbage, mainly rotten food. They might first have molasses smeared on them to make them sticky, and then all kinds of truly gross things will be tossed at them: rotten eggs, fish or fish guts, sour milk, dog food, and so on. And this is supposed to be fun.
Right.
Sometimes the friends get carried away, and not only the soon-to-be bride and groom get attacked, but also the best man and the bridesmaid. It's all taken in stride, and usually there are no hard feelings. But why do people do this, and more importantly, allow it to be done to them? Well, it's said to bring good luck to the happy couple, the idea being that if they can put up with something so awful at the start of their marriage, they'll pull through as a couple. Think of it as a kind of marital baptism by fire, only with stinky fish guts. It also represents an event that they can't control, unlike every other aspect of their wedding. And I think that's the key, really. If they can cope with the unexpected early on, that bodes well for their future. And this is, one of the tropes of every wedding movie ever made, is how they have it all planned out and it all goes horribly wrong. That's literally the idea that they're representing here. It's also a way to bring the community together, since all their friends, families, and neighbors can get in on the plot to capture the couple, arrange when and where to do it, and decide what disgusting things they can toss at them. So this strange ritual can actually bring everyone closer together. Of course, sometimes the attackers can get carried away and unintended injuries can happen, but in general, it ends up being a good, if messy, time for everyone. This unusual custom seems to have begun as a pre-wedding cleansing ritual for brides, where their feet would be covered in soot from a chimney and then washed to symbolize their transition to a new life. As time went on, this custom evolved into a more vigorous and elaborate blackening, with not just the feet getting covered and not just with ash. Still, why fish guts? The custom could also be a way for the couple and the community to do something unusual, even odd for themselves, in the face of so much commercialization around weddings and every other celebration. They can put a unique Scottish touch on the whole getting married business that is unique to their region. Given how revolting blackening is, it probably will stay that way. That's wonderful. I mean, it's funny for a laugh about. I wouldn't want it to happen to me.
Yeah, absolutely not. But yeah, as you said it in the book, I mean, it's one of those things that kind of represents marriage, because if you can live through something as horrible as that, you can live through anything.
Yeah. And I think part of it is also the bride and groom know it's coming, but they don't know when it's coming. They're not like, well, it's Friday, they're going to abduct us. It could be any time in the few weeks leading up to the wedding, and so they have to just live with that. It's the unknown, the unexpected. And I think there's a lesson there that they have to face the unexpected together. And if they can put up with difficult, it's the for better or worse. This is the worst, this is part of the whole thing. So I think that the joke there is that, well, if you can put up with this and be unexpectedly doused with molasses and fish entrails, then you're going to do okay if this doesn't upset you too much, And it can also be a way for the family to kind of the family and community to sort of bond with each other. The in-laws can sort of get to meet each other and hang out and plan this horrible diabolical thing and have a good laugh about it. And it's an ice-breaking thing, and it's a way for them to actually come together a little bit as a community. But I also like the idea that it's a tradition that's probably, I can see the blackening the feet with ash is probably something much older. I can see that being a 17th, 18th, even 16th century tradition. But this strikes me as being potentially something that's been a revival in the last 40 or 50 years of that tradition, that they decided, well, yeah, weddings are so crass and they're so commercial and so expensive. Let's do something that's unique to our part of Scotland, this little part of the world that's uniquely ours. It has become a kind of modern folk custom in its own way. It's become like something that's unique to them. And they've invented a new tradition that's now, embedded in the culture of Northeast Scottish folklore and society. I think that's fun when you see people actually do sort of things like that. They come back with new ideas and they say, well, we're going to invent something new, because folk traditions are always being invented. We don't realize when we talk about folklore, we talk about folk customs, we think of things like, Morris dancing in England or whatever, or something that's been around for hundreds of years. But we're always inventing new folk traditions and things, whatever those might be. There are whole anthropological studies about that and about what those might mean and what significance they have to individuals and communities. So I like to think of something like this is very much just sort of participating in a fun new folk ritual that hopefully will stick around for a while. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, we've changed it from folklore to urban legend. Same exact thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. And urban legends, which I've got some doozies in here, are fantastic. There's one I'd love to read in a minute, but yeah, I think urban legends have become they're a form of modern folklore. They're a form of because I can look at things like going back to the Christmas book, things like Krampus and like Svartpete and these horrible creatures that live in forests and whatever. I can see those as being the urban legends of the 16th century. They're the same kind of thing. Don't go out because the cannibal witch in the woods will get you. Or I knew a friend of a friend got abducted by the witch and was never seen again. It's literally the exact same thing, and it also, to me, it borders on cryptid sightings and those sorts of things as well. It's another thing. There is something in the woods, and I've seen it, and my friend saw it, and we're not sure what it is. And that's, I think there's a continuation of that tradition as well. So whether they're real or not, cryptic monsters are in themselves a part of our contemporary folklore as well, as are UFOs, as all of those things. Now there may be objective reality to those things, but we have made them a part of our collective consciousness, such that they're very important parts of things that we now encounter and believe. And some people are very devoted to them. Some people think they're not true, but they're there as a part of our culture. Absolutely. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, going all the way back to ancient man, I mean, there was always a story as to why to not go do something, because prime example, people going missing. It's the unexplained, because if you never find a body, you don't know what happened, but you have to come up with an explanation. It's the human nature.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of urban legends and ghost stories, what was the one that you were talking about?
Oh, well,
what was the most interesting to you, and why?
I love, let's see where I can find it. It's utterly horrible. It's pure urban legend, but the thing is, you could actually, especially in this day and age, see this happening. It's almost a Shakespearean comedy when you look at it. It actually has elements of that. It's called The Horrifying Blind Date. I don't know if you read this one, but it's fantastic. You can kind of see where it's coming, but it could be like Act 3 of a Shakespearean comedy, the way it ends.
Okay.
So this urban legend is part of the mistaken identity genre of urban legends, where everything seems to be going great until some awful revelation ruins everything. There are many versions of this legend, but this one is appropriately updated to the modern world. It's set at a time before exchanging pictures online was the norm, and people were more likely to remain anonymous. A young man is lonely and goes looking for love on the internet. That's his first mistake. He ends up meeting someone in a chat room. So we're talking 20, 25 years ago,
right?
The old days of AOL. He and this other person hit it off right away and start writing to each other privately. This back and forth goes on for some time, and it all seems to be going well. They keep the conversations light, and they don't tell each other much about themselves, always a sensible safety precaution online. Finally, they arrange to meet in person in a public place. In some versions, it's a cafe, in others, it's a beach. They set a time and a date, both excited for the big day. The young man has finally met someone that he really connects with and might have a shot at building a relationship with. This is the real deal. He's nervous, but he's determined to see it through. He showers, dresses up nice, fusses with his hair to get it to look just right, and sets off. It's getting dark, and he makes his way to the appointed place, certain that he's about to meet the woman of his dreams. And then he sees her, in the distance. A woman stands with her back to him. She's wearing just what she said she'd be wearing. In some versions, it's a nice dress. In others, shorts and a skirt, and a shirt. And she seems to be fidgeting nervously. His heart pounding, he resolves to go through with it and starts towards her. This is it. It's really happening. As he approaches, he calls out to her, using her username as they'd agreed. She turns around, excited, flashing a big smile. Her eyes widen. His eyes widen. He can hardly breathe, and he's at a loss for words. He starts to shake and gets lightheaded. Finally, a single word escapes from his trembling lips. Mom?
God.
It may not be true, but it should be. I love it.
Well, and that mom had to have come up with a very odd username for him not to recognize her.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Shakespearean comedy at that point. It's the comedy of errors, there are versions of that go back centuries, but I just love that one. It's completely updated for the modern. You could totally see that like two people exchanging letters in Renaissance Italy or something, and the same thing happens. Mother,
Right.
This is just an updated chat room version of it, but I think it's hilarious.
Well, and what's even funnier is you would think, mother and son, it's a very interesting bond, but you would think that if it were true, they would be sharing back and forth. Oh, I've met this great person,
Right. Yeah. Unless they wanted, don't tell anyone else about this. I mean,
right.
I can't. Yeah, I'm not going to tell anybody about this. So we have to keep this secret. So, yeah. But the comedy of errors and mistaken identities is a major trope in Shakespeare's plays, Twelfth Night and Comedy of Errors and various others. And there's where people disguise themselves and then find out that they're someone other than they thought. This is the Commedia dell'arte. This is comic gold that goes back all the way to Roman times. So
right.
Yeah. But I just thought that one highly amused me. It's not so much well, it is terrifying for the son, but it's
right.
funny for the rest of us. So it's funny that these sorts of legends persist. And like I say, I imagine versions of this are very, very old, and each generation finds new ways to update them and come up with new ways of telling and retelling them, which is I always find really fun. It's just
right.
like what if you're talking about urban legends, what new things are going to come up, and what story happened to the friend of a friend that everybody is sure actually happened, but you find versions of it dating back to the 1920s. They're great. I love urban legends in general. I think they're just really, really fun.
Right. We hear all the time about different countries banning certain holidays. Valentine's Day is, no exception here. And something that you put in the book, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is because it's become so materialistic and commercialized that a lot of countries don't want any part of that.
Yeah.
Now, in all of your research, I saw that there was a couple of countries that were named, but were there more than what we really think of?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of them tend to be more religiously conservative. There's a number of Islamic countries, but there's also places in Russia, for instance, where there's a real dislike for it. I think there's a sense in some, and it goes back to what you think the purpose of society really is, I think. And some of these more conservative or authoritarian governments don't like the idea of that level of freedom of expression. And I really think it does come down to something as simple as that. There's an amusing thing. We talked about that in one particular city, Belgorod in Russia, actually decided to issue its own ban on Valentine's Day in 2011. The holiday is still celebrated elsewhere in Russia, but this particular principality, they just said, no, we're not doing it. The deputy governor said that if they were to have Valentine's Day, I love it, they might as well also have a vodka day where everyone presumably drinks themselves silly. I can see that actually going over really well. Replace Valentine's. It's still a V, it's still a V day. It's Valentine's. It's now vodka day instead. I can see that being a real smash hit there. But some countries, we've seen various places like Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan both have proclamations. Although what you find in countries like this is that there's a disconnect between what the authorities say you're supposed to do and what people actually do. And as my understanding is, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, it was officially banned only since 2018. But people still tend to do it anyway. In theory, if you're selling cards or candy on February 14th, you could be fined, arrested and fined. People tend to do it anyway. I think a lot of these laws are more like, man shakes fist at cloud sort of things. Old man shakes fist at cloud. They're meant to try to reestablish an authoritarian government's authority, but a lot of people just sort of thumb their nose at it or kind of nod openly but quietly, do whatever they want. And so I think this is an example of that. Valentine's Day is seen by some authoritarians as being subversive because it allows too much freedom of choice for their liking. But in the end, people are going to do what they're going to do, and you can't suppress that. So I think these sorts of things are silly. They're an example of control freak type nature that governments like to have sometimes. And I think people are just going to eventually, they're just going to ignore them, and in most places, they're not really wildly enforced. It's one of those, it's more like an official statement rather than something. They don't have time to be sending police around trying to arrest people for sending Valentine's Day cards. It's silly. So yeah, they tend to be more like statements of purpose rather than, and I'm sure they do occasionally give people a hard time for that, but vodka day, that's the one I think that really needs to become a thing.
I mean, in coinciding with Valentine's Day, if you don't get the Valentine of your choice, it would make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was a kid in school, we were supposed to send Valentine's little things that we would cut out to every other kid in the class. I don't know if you did that.
Yeah.
I was young in the 70s. That was a thing we did. And I don't think anybody does that anymore. But that was, you were just supposed to say why you liked that person and send them like a little construction paper heart or something like that. And you were supposed to pass them out to everybody so that everybody got them. It's, so that was in public school in the 1970s. So,
right.
I do remember that. Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, and it was always you gave a Valentine to everybody. You didn't just give a Valentine to the one that you wanted to.
Right. Yeah.
But I also grew up in the era, and even to this day, where it's, and there's nothing wrong with this, getting an award or a trophy for just participating. But it's one of those things where, the winners are always more celebrated than the ones that just participated.
Right. If you have to give a Valentine's Day card to everyone, then you're not really giving one to anyone. You're sort of like, the whole point is that it's, but I guess they didn't want all the popular kids getting them and the not popular kids not getting anything. So it's well-intentioned. I can see it being well-intentioned, but it kind of undermines the purpose of the whole thing anyway. So
the tradition, right.
Yeah. And a lot of people, just look at Valentine's Day as just a crass commercial excuse to waste money anyway. I lean toward that myself.
But absolutely, 100%.
Some people take it very seriously. I'm not one of them. Hence why I wrote this book.
Right. All right. One of the last questions I have for you, because it's one that really fascinated me, is in this book you include ghost weddings, and I've heard of people having ghost weddings. More specifically, living person marrying a dead person. There was a part in the news not too long ago about a woman marrying a ghost pirate,
right,
and then eventually she ended up getting a divorce because he cheated on her or something like that, and it was so odd. So what are your thoughts on this practice and why you included it in the book?
Well, it's a long established folk tradition in China, interestingly enough, and it's taken very seriously. It still is. And it's, again, we talk about authoritarian governments trying to police things, but China has a fairly authoritarian government, and they have cracked down on it, but not for the reasons you think. So I'll read a little bit about it. It's fascinating. So when it comes to marriage customs, the ghost wedding is an ancient ceremony found in several cultures around the world. It's especially common in China, where it's a tradition dating back more than 2,000 years. The ceremony is what you would think it is, only there's more to the ritual. A ghost wedding involves the marriage of, in this case, it involves the marriage of two dead people, or in some cases, one living person and one dead person. So what's the purpose behind these ceremonies? The answer has to do with cultural expectations as well as Chinese philosophy. There's an abiding belief that all things need to be in union with their opposite, as shown in the famous yin-yang symbol. Because of this, when anyone who is unmarried dies, there is a fear that the person's soul will be unhappy in the afterlife unless it can be joined with a companion. To remedy this, family members of the dead person will sometimes seek out someone else who also died unmarried, and then with that family's blessing, join the two in a symbolic marriage ceremony so that they can be together in death. Obviously, this kind of ritual is intended for family members, and like a funeral, it is meant as a way of honoring the dead. On the more macabre side, the bride's bones will often be dug up and reinterred with those of her new husband so that they can be together forever in this world as well as in the next. In some cases, people have claimed that the deceased reached out to them and requested a spouse. The dead might even contact the living through dreams or make a relative sick until they hold a seance and discover the true cause of the illness. Once the family pledges to marry the dead family member, the spirit relents and the sickness goes away. In China, there was a long-standing cultural belief that having an unwed daughter brought shame to the family. So if she died unwed, this was a chance to restore the family's honor as well as to give her spirit some peace. In more recent decades, especially in Southeast Asia, there have been controversial marriages between a living and a dead person. In some cases, it has involved a woman marrying the man whom she intended to marry, but who tragically was taken from her. She could then adopt a child and carry on his family name. There have also been stories of grave robbing. In the Shaanxi province in 2015, the corpses of 14 women were stolen and sold to families who needed dead brides for their weddings. Unfortunately, there are even reports of murder where someone is killed so that their body can be sold for marriage purposes. Of course, this is illegal and the Chinese government has tried to crack down on it, but in more rural areas, the sinister practice of selling corpses for ghost weddings may continue. So it takes a dark turn. It's, an ancient practice, but yeah, we're finding now that people are straight up being murdered so that they can be sold for people that want them for weddings. Yeah.
Fascinating in and of itself, but also very macabre for sure.
Yes. Well, that's the point of the book.
Right. Well, we are getting close to the end of the show, so I wanted to give you a chance to tell everybody where they can find you, find the books.
Sure.
The mic's all yours.
Sure. I'm just at timrayborn.com. All of my things are there. Just Google my name, Tim Rayborn. You can find all my website has all of my books and my musical recordings and other things. I'm also on various social media. If you want to look me up on Blue Sky or particularly Blue Sky and Threads and other places, you can find me there. I don't do X anymore. I don't do Twitter anymore, but you can find me on Blue Sky certainly. I just finished, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, I just finished the third book in this series, which is a little bit different, but it should be out toward the end of the year, and it's going to be called The Scary Book of Fairy Tales. So it's going to be looking at those original Grimm's tales and a lot of others, and they are not Disney tales, I can assure you. They are pretty horrific. So I'm excited to have that one out into the world, and I'm hoping it'll be the same artist working on it again, and we can continue it. So I'd love to come back and talk about that one when it's out, which will probably be here. But a lot of people, of course, they only know the Disney versions, but the original versions of Snow White and Cinderella and Rapunzel are pretty horrific.
Oh yeah, and I mean, the movie that came out with Matt Damon and Heath Ledger.
Oh yeah, brothers
was very close to being close to the originals, telling some of the original stories. But yeah, most people don't realize how dark the Grimm's fairy tales actually were. And
for me, they come from the same tradition as the German Christmas monsters as well. It's the don't go into the woods warning. It's all of that. So it ties in nicely with the first book. So yeah, I literally just sent the manuscript into HarperCollins last week for that. So it'll be out. My guess is probably October, November, something like that. So yeah, looking forward to it. So yeah, the series will continue.
All right. Sounds good. All right, I'm going to put you in limbo for just a second. Sure. Stick around, and I'll bring you back in.
Great.
All right, folks, that is Tim Rayborn. Make sure you're checking out all of his books because they're all very fascinating. Next week, we'll be talking UFOs, and I think we'll be on UFOs for a couple of weeks. But Erik will be back then as well. So, as I had mentioned earlier, this is a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. Until next week, folks, where you'll find us same time, same channel. My name's Justin. Have a good day.